The music pulsed gently through the grand hall of the hotel. Strings of fairy lights twinkling against tall glass windows. Everyone was dressed in their finest, glasses clinking, laughter blooming like wildflowers. At the center of it all stood Sophie Davies, radiant in white, her wedding veil catching the soft light like a halo. She laughed beside her new husband, her bridesmaids doting on her, her in-laws beaming. But at table 17, Arthur Hughes sat alone. He had arrived early, in a carefully pressed suit that still smelled faintly of his dry cleaner's lavender starch. His gift, an antique clock passed down 3 generations, sat unopened on the gift table, ignored. He'd barely had time to register the room when Sophie's friend Morgan approached him, cheeks pink, eyes darting. Arthur ... I'm really sorry. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing the reach. And if this story has you hooked, hit subscribe now. A new one's coming tomorrow, so don't miss it. Let's continue. Morgan mumbled. Sophie asked me to let you know. She thought it might be better if you didn't stay for the reception. Arthur blinked. I beg your pardon. It's just, things have been tense, you know. She thought today should be about peace and ... double quotes. Arthur didn't hear the rest. His ears rang with the sudden absence of her voice. He didn't argue. He simply rose, buttoned his jacket, and walked out past the fountains, leaving behind the celebration he had worked 3 jobs to help pay for. He didn't take the main road home. He walked through Hyde Park instead. His steps slow, deliberate. He passed a group of boys playing football, their cheers echoing across the trees. He remembered when Sophie used to run through that same park, kite string wrapped around her fingers, her laughter trailing behind like a banner. He sat on a bench and stared at the Serpentine, the wind stirring faint ripples across its surface. Hours passed. The light changed. The bench grew colder, and still he sat, not ready to return to silence. Arthur returned to an empty flat, one that had once been bursting with Sophie's teenage energy music playing too loud, the smell of burning toast, the clutter of art supplies across the floor. Now it was still, quiet. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat by the window, the city's lights glowing like distant fireflies. He remembered the days when he'd come home from 12-hour shifts, still in his postman's uniform, to cook dinner and quiz Sophie on her homework. He remembered the nights he'd stayed up till dawn fixing a broken boiler so she wouldn't wake to a cold house. He'd never asked for gratitude. But this? The rejection cut deeper than he expected. He opened an old box from the closet, Sophie's. School awards, her first pair of ballet shoes, the note she'd written him on his birthday when she was 9. You're the best daddy in the world. He ran his fingers over the worn paper, then tucked it back gently. The silence of the flat wasn't just quiet. It was absence. It was the hollow left behind by years of effort she never saw. Sophie Davies sat at a long marble table on a sunlit terrace overlooking the hills of Florence, her honeymoon breakfast untouched. Oliver Harris watched her from across the table, his brow furrowed as she picked at a croissant with deliberate, distracted fingers. Still no appetite? He asked gently. She didn't respond immediately. Her eyes were locked on a group of pigeons fluttering across a church steeple. When she finally looked at him, her voice was hollow. I didn't expect it to feel like this. Like what? Like I left something burning behind me. Oliver leaned forward, elbows on the table. Soph, I've been quiet because I know how complicated things are between you two. But you didn't even let him stay. That wasn't just a boundary. That was punishment. He's always made me feel small, Oliver. Controlled. Like I owed him every breath. Maybe he didn't know how to be soft. But I saw the man who showed up early, in a suit he probably couldn't afford to clean, with a gift he clearly poured love into. That wasn't indifference. That was love, awkward and clumsy, but love. Sophie turned away, tears gathering. She didn't say anything else. Later, they wandered through the Uffizi gallery. Sophie lingered in front of Botticelli's La Primavera, her gaze drawn to the way Flora's dress moved like wind in silk. She wondered what her father would have said about the painting. He loved history. He'd once spent an entire Saturday building her a paper model of the Colosseum. She swallowed the lump rising in her throat. The apartment smelled of fresh paint and unopened boxes. Sophie stood in the middle of their new living room in Clapham, surrounded by a forest of wedding gifts. The air was still, as if holding its breath. She had spent the morning sorting through the pile of cards and neatly labeled packages, all from people who had clinked glasses and smiled brightly at the wedding. Most of them, she realized, had never even asked her what her father was like. Oliver walked in with 2 coffees, handing one to her. "That's the last of the boxes from the car," he said. "Found one marked from Arthur. You want it now? Or later?" She froze. "Put it on the table." They opened it together. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was the antique clock. Polished wood. Brass details. Its hands perfectly still, as if frozen in time. A letter rested beneath it. Her name in careful cursive on the front. Sophie sat slowly and opened the note. "Time isn't something we can buy back, love. But it's something we can choose to. Share while it still ticks. I'm proud of you. Always. Dad." She read it 3 times. Then again. Her chest ached with something like grief, but softer remorse maybe. Or longing. Oliver said nothing. He simply placed his hand on her shoulder, grounding her. The next day, Sophie couldn't stop thinking about the clock. She brought it into her studio, propped it on the shelf above her easel, and painted for the first time since the wedding. She didn't think, just moved. The canvas took shape slowly. An old bench by a quiet river. A figure slouched in solitude. By evening, her hands were covered in paint. The studio smelled of turpentine and autumn. She sat on the floor and cried. Later, when Oliver checked on her, she simply said, "I think I need to go see him." He nodded. "I'll drive you." Arthur's flat hadn't changed. The narrow hallway still creaked. The wallpaper still bore the faint outlines of where old photos once hung. Sophie paused at the door, heart pounding. Her hand hovered above the bell. Oliver stepped beside her. "Want me to come in?" She shook her head. "This part, I need to do alone." She rang the bell. The door opened slowly. Arthur stood in the doorway, wearing an old wool jumper with the sleeves pushed up, gardening gloves still on. He blinked, stunned. "Sophie?" "Hi, Dad." There was a beat of silence. He looked older than she remembered, his shoulders more stooped, his eyes ringed with fatigue. "Are you all right?" he asked. She shook her head, her voice catching. "No, I'm not. Can I come in?" He stepped aside. "Course you can." Inside, the place smelled of rosemary and earth. Potted plants crowded the windowsills. A pot of tea steamed gently on the kitchen table. They sat opposite each other, hands wrapped around mismatched mugs. Silence stretched between them, neither quite knowing where to start. "I was angry for a long time," Sophie said at last. "I felt like you never really saw me, just managed me." Arthur's hands tightened on the cup. "You think I didn't see you?" "Sophie, I saw everything. Every time you stayed up late drawing, I snuck in and switched off your lamp. Every dance recital, I was at the back. I kept quiet because I didn't want to embarrass you." She looked at him, tears welling. "Then why did it feel like you only ever said no?" He sighed. "Because I was scared. Of failing you. Of letting you down." I was trying to protect you in the only way I knew how. I didn't realize how much that looked like control. They sat in silence again. But this time, it was filled with understanding. I got your clock, Sophie whispered. It's beautiful. He smiled softly. It was your granddad's. He gave it to me when I moved out. Said it would remind me of time well spent. Sophie reached across the table, took his hand. I want to start spending more time with you, she said. Arthur's voice was rough. I'd like that. The first time Sophie came by on her own, it was raining. Arthur met her at the door with a grin and 2 raincoats, one of which looked suspiciously like it hadn't been worn in decades. They spent the afternoon in the garden, pulling weeds and laying compost. Arthur showed her the new section he was digging for strawberries. Sophie, fingernails caked in dirt, found herself laughing at his methodical seriousness. As the months wore on, visits became routine. Wednesday dinners, Sunday gardening, occasional weeknight phone calls. Arthur began teaching her the names of every flower in his patch. Hellebore, foxglove, phlox. She teased him for the Latin. One weekend, they rebuilt the shed. Another, they organized the attic. Sophie discovered an old collection of her childhood drawings, lovingly kept in a leather-bound portfolio. Her voice cracked as she flipped through them. You saved all of these? Arthur didn't look up from where he was sorting screws. You think I was going to throw away your version of the solar system? I never forgot that Saturn had a smiley face. She laughed, and something in her heart mended. Over tea one spring evening, Arthur surprised her with a battered recipe book. Your mum's, he said simply. Thought you might want to try some of the old favorites. Sophie ran her fingers over the notes in the margins. The handwriting was unmistakable. They spent hours cooking together. The kitchen, once a quiet space, filled with conversation and clattering pans. They burned things, improvised wildly, laughed when the soup turned out purple. The past didn't disappear, but it stopped feeling like a wound. Instead, it became a foundation. On one of their longer walks, Arthur finally asked, Do you remember the lake house in Kent? Sophie nodded. I loved that place. We sold it after your mum passed. I always regretted that. She paused. Let's go there. Rent it for a weekend. Just you and me. He looked at her, eyes crinkling. I'd like that very much. They arrived at the lake house just past midday. The car winding through narrow Kentish roads bordered by hedgerows and the occasional flash of poppies. It was smaller than Sophie remembered, though the red shutters were still bright. The ivy still creeping along the stone walls like it had never left. Arthur stood on the gravel drive for a long time, looking at the house. Sophie watched him, seeing the memory move behind his eyes. We planted a pear tree right over there, he said at last, pointing to a spot now overtaken by wild grass. You were 5. Dug half the hole yourself. I remember, Sophie murmured. We buried a time capsule under it. A drawing and a stuffed bear. Arthur smiled. Bruiser. You made him a superhero cape out of one of my old ties. They spent the afternoon unpacking groceries, lighting the old stove, and airing out rooms that smelled faintly of cedar and dust. Sophie opened the windows in her old bedroom, where sunlight streamed through the lace curtains her mother had sewn by hand. The dresser still bore the faint outline of a sticker she'd once stubbornly refused to remove. In the evening, they walked along the lake, the water still and mirror-like, reflecting the deep blues of the sky and the rustle of trees. They didn't speak much. The silence was reverent. Back inside, after dinner, Arthur pulled a photo album from a suitcase. It was battered, edges fraying, full of bent corners and handwritten captions. They sat at the kitchen table and turned each page slowly. Your mum took that one, Arthur said, pointing to a photo of Sophie on the dock, arms raised in triumph over a paper boat. She made you wear that awful sun hat. Sophie smiled, fingers tracing the image. I remember her laugh. It was big, loud, like it bounced off everything. Arthur nodded. His voice was rough. I missed her every day after she was gone. But I think I grieved so hard I forgot how to show you what was left. You didn't forget, Dad. You just carried it differently. They stayed up late, talking about her childhood, his regrets, her fears about becoming a parent one day. The grief between them became something softer, like shared shelter from a storm long past. The next morning, they found the spot where the pear tree had stood. The tree itself was gone, but after half an hour of digging, they unearthed a rusted tin lunchbox inside, a sun-bleached drawing, barely legible, and a stuffed bear with threadbare paws and a faded cape. Sophie held him to her chest, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Arthur reached out, brushing dirt from the bear's stitched nose. Still looks like a hero to me. The birth was long. Sophie lay in the recovery room, pale but glowing, while Oliver sat beside her, holding their daughter with the stunned tenderness of someone holding a miracle. Grace Harris had arrived just past dawn, squalling and strong, with a tuft of dark hair and her grandfather's eyes. Arthur waited outside the maternity ward for nearly 6 hours. He'd shown up before visiting hours, carrying a small bouquet of garden roses and a wrapped parcel. When Oliver stepped into the hallway, he greeted Arthur with a tired but genuine smile. They're ready. Arthur entered the room slowly. Sophie was propped up against pillows, looking exhausted and luminous all at once. She turned her head when she saw him. Hi, Dad. He couldn't speak for a moment. His eyes were locked on the bundle in her arms. Sophie gently passed Grace to him. Meet your granddaughter. Arthur cradled the baby like she was made of glass. His breath hitched. She's perfect. He sat by the bed, holding Grace, and didn't move for a long time. In the months that followed, Arthur became a fixture in their lives. He helped build Grace's crib, read her bedtime stories in a low, gravelly voice that seemed to soothe her instantly, and took long walks with Sophie through the park while the baby slept on his chest. Sophie found herself calling him more, asking him for advice, sharing worries. They disagreed sometimes on how to discipline, on screen time, on lullabies, but now, disagreement didn't feel like a fracture. It felt like family. One night, while Sophie rocked Grace back to sleep, she found herself humming a tune her father used to whistle while he washed dishes. She smiled. The melody wove its way into her daughter's dreams. When Grace turned 1, the family gathered in the back garden of their home. There were balloons, fairy cakes, and neighbors cooing over Grace's determined waddle. Arthur brought a gift wrapped in tissue, and string dot inside was a music box. He'd carved it himself. When Sophie opened the lid, a gentle lullaby played, familiar, tender. Inside, a tiny wooden bear with a red cape turned slowly in circles. Sophie pressed her hand to her mouth. Arthur looked at her. Still looks like a hero to me. She wrapped her arms around him. Not just in thanks. In recognition. Grace was 3. The first time Sophie raised her voice in front of Arthur. It was a rainy Thursday. Grace had been cranky all afternoon, refusing to nap, and Arthur, attempting to help, had gently insisted she try a quiet time routine. Grace had screamed. Sophie had snapped. Don't override me like that, Dad. I'm her mother. The silence that followed was thick. Arthur stood frozen, his face unreadable. Later that evening, after Grace had finally fallen asleep, Arthur stood by the window sipping tea. Sophie joined him, arms folded. "I'm sorry," she said. He turned, his voice low. "You were right. I stepped in when I shouldn't have." She shook her head. "No, I wasn't just upset about that. I was afraid that I'd become you, that I'd parent the way you did, strict, distant. But I think I just don't want to fail her." Arthur placed a hand on her shoulder. "You won't. But you'll get things wrong, same as I did. What matters is what you do after." Over time, Sophie came to understand the rhythm of her father's advice. It was never intrusive, just there when she needed it. When Grace got sick for the first time, Arthur arrived with soup and a thermometer older than Sophie. When she had to travel for work, Arthur stayed over, reading Grace stories and watching her dance across the living room in her princess dress. The past, though softened, didn't disappear. One autumn, Sophie discovered an unopened letter tucked into one of her mother's old recipe books. It was addressed to her, written years before. "I hope you'll remember your father's love, even when it doesn't look the way you need it to. He never learned how to say it, but he shows it every day. Give him time. Love has its own language." Sophie sat with the letter for a long time. Then she made tea, brought the letter to Arthur, and read it aloud to him. His hands trembled. "She always saw more than I gave her credit for," he whispered. Sophie nodded. "She saw you. So do I." The next morning, they planted a new pear tree. In Sophie's garden, Grace helped pat down the soil, her hands small and sure. Arthur tied a ribbon around the young trunk, smiling. "Every year we'll watch it grow," he said. Sophie looked at the tree, then at her father. "Just like us." Time passed quietly. Grace grew tall and thoughtful, with a streak of stubbornness that made Sophie laugh and Arthur nod in recognition. She loved climbing trees, asking impossible questions, and helping her grandfather water the garden. Arthur moved a little slower now. He walked with a cane. Sometimes his hands trembled while slicing bread. Sophie noticed, but he never complained. He still came over every Sunday, still brought his stories and steady presence. Grace adored him. One spring morning, as they sat on the garden bench near the pear tree, Arthur took Sophie's hand. "There are things I wish I'd done differently," he said. "But this garden, this family, this peace, it's more than I ever hoped for." Sophie looked at him, her voice thick. "You gave us all of it, even when I couldn't see it." He smiled, eyes soft. "You saw it in the end. That's what matters." Later that year, Arthur grew ill. Nothing sudden, just the long, quiet retreat of age. Sophie and Oliver brought him to live with them. Grace helped make up his room, placing her music box on the knitstand in the evenings. He and Sophie would sit together and listen to old records. She would read aloud from the newspaper. He would hum under his breath, the same tune she now hummed to Grace. One night, as the first snow began to fall, Arthur asked Sophie to bring the clock. "It still works," she said, winding it gently. "So do we," he murmured, closing his eyes. When he passed, it was quiet, peaceful. Sophie sat by his side, holding his hand, whispering, "Thank you for everything." The funeral was small, dignified. Grace released a white balloon into the winter sky. Sophie read aloud from her mother's letter. Back home, she placed the clock on the mantel. Beneath it, the music box in the garden. The pear tree bloomed years later. Grace stood at the front of a classroom, reading aloud from a worn notebook. Her voice was clear, poised, touched with a warmth that reminded Sophie of another time. And my grandfather taught me that love isn't always loud. Sometimes it's in the things we fix, the things we save, and the time we choose to give. He planted trees so I could watch them grow. The children listened, rapt, their crayons still in hand. Outside, the pear tree in the schoolyard, grown from a graft Sophie had given to the head teacher, swayed in the wind. Sophie watched from the doorway, heart full. The clock still ticked in their home. The music box still played its lullaby. And Arthur Hughes lived on, not in monuments or plaques, but in the stories his family told, the rituals they kept, and the quiet, daily acts of love dotted dinner that night. Grace passed the potatoes to her mum, then to her dad. Sophie smiled. "Don't forget Granddad's seat," Grace said, tapping the empty chair beside her. They placed a plate there, as they always did. Not from grief, but from memory, from love. Because he still had a seat at the table, and he always would.